is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nigel Farage.
Prime Minister May has been accused by Labour and the trade unions of watering down her plans to tackle corporate excesses. Under her reforms, the UK's biggest firms will have to reveal how much more money their chief execs earn compared to average workers. Also, she is encouraging workers to be represented on boards. But whatever Labour say about this being feeble, does there need to be a debate about a fundamental reform of business corporate pay in the UK? And if so, whose responsibility is it to change things, the government's or shareholders? Well, I've wondered right from the start, because it was very interesting that Theresa May is a Conservative, and yet, in the Tory manifesto, she wanted to be very interventionist about the amount of money that chief executives are paid. When it comes to it, she has said today that workers need to have voices on boards, and that there must be full declaration of what chief execs earn, and that she'll encourage shareholders to perhaps become more active. So what is really going on out there? Well, it's what I call the modern corporate world. To me, it's a long way away from what genuine free market capitalism ought to be. And I just wonder, when David Cameron became Prime Minister, the average chief exec earned 145 times what the average factory worker earned. By 2020, it's going to be 214 times that amount. So I'm Nigel Farage. Yes, it's a different voice. Ian Dale's away on holiday, and I'm going to be doing the drive show from 4 till 7 every day between now and Friday. Ian has let me loose with his listeners, which is very brave of him in many ways. So this is the first topic we're going to discuss. Is it right for government to intervene? Could government perhaps, and remember that the European Union already have set limits on what companies may pay individuals in terms of bonuses? Is it right for government to intervene, or does that lead, in the end, to a form of statism that means in the end government tells us what the price of a loaf of bread should be? Or should it be up to shareholders to deal with this kind of thing? And is there some evidence that, in fact, over the last couple of years, shareholders have become more active? They don't mind chief execs who are paying big dividends and doing well, earning big money, but maybe a few have been freeloading. And to help me through this difficult topic is a man who knows his way round the odd corporate boardroom or two. It's David Buick, market analyst for Panmure Gordon. David, good afternoon.
And good afternoon to you, Nigel.
So we've got a Tory government here who, in many ways, David, are being interventionist. But is the Prime Minister right to put a finger on a problem that actually those at the top get paid more and more and more compared to the average worker?
Nigel, we don't want sound bites, which is what we're getting. You cannot compare apples with pears. And to come out with chief executives earning, whether it's 140 times or 220 times what the average worker works, it sounds dreadful, but you've got to put the thing in context. Shareholders for so many years have abrogated their responsibilities, and when excessive pay awards have been put up before the board, occasionally used to get the odd objection, but it was always waved through. These people have serious stakes in these companies, and they have to make their thoughts very clear on the subject. Secondly, there's a huge difference, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, because you and I both worked in smaller companies numerically. I don't mean, people. You and I have never worked with people who've got thousands and thousands of employees. It's been a business in both of our cases that's been driven on profitability, and
Yep.
you get paid accordingly.
Yep.
But you cannot pay entrepreneurs under the same basis as you pay managers. For instance, let me just draw an analogy which will bring howls of mirth and grief from your listeners. Sir Martin Sorrell, he's been at
We've lost David Buick, who was about to tell us about corporate excess. Well, we're going to get David Buick back on the line. ISDN just crashed on us. David was making the point there that the big shareholders have big stakes in these companies, and that they would not allow duds to get overpaid. And remember, this conversation, folks, you're driving home from work or wherever you are, and, why are they talking about the City and the FTSE 100? It doesn't affect me. Do you know something? It affects every single one of you, because every single one of you that's put any money aside into a pension fund is invested in these companies. So it's in all of our interests that this balance be got right. I'm going to go to Sam in Aberdeen whilst we hunt David Buick down. Sam, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Well, I'm all right, but I'm sort of puzzled because I've always considered myself, Sam, to be a believer in capitalism. I'm not sure these days we've actually got it. I think we've got sort of corporatism. I do worry, and I was being ticked off there by David Buick for talking in sound bites by saying that, you know, the average salary of bosses was going up exponentially. But I feel, Sam, I mean, my own view is government shouldn't meddle in what people get paid. I think that's a mistake. But I personally think...
I absolutely agree with you. But agree with you more.
But I just think once government starts to mess around with these things, it generally makes an absolute mess of it. But I do think that there is a strong argument for genuine shareholder activism at AGMs if people are being paid too much money for, frankly, being duds. That's my view, Sam. What do you think?
Well, I think the problem is with entrusting the government to have any kind of input in this is first we have to have some kind of trust in the government. So without that, we're not even off the starting blocks. So
now that, Sam, could take quite a long time, couldn't it?
I mean, why on earth would we be... I totally agree with you. We live in a society now which is crony capitalist and global corporatism. So you've got multinational global corporations that infiltrate governments. You know, most of our politicians, we can all agree they're bottom paid for. We all agree with that, left and right. So why on earth would we trust these people to go in and have such influence in corporations? And why, you know, I think in a world where we live in sort of global corporatism, you know, it's a double-edged sword. We need to live in a society where we've got successful businesses operating. They can employ people. You know, I work for a big corporation in the oil industry, and it's, you know, it employs thousands of people. Now, I don't know what those what the CEOs and shareholders get paid. I'm sure they haven't had pay cuts like we have in the recent climate. But without industry and without business, we'd all be unemployed. So why on earth would we start harassing people and causing people to want to leave the country? That's my point.
Yeah, I mean, Sam, you know, clearly in the corporate world, those ratios between what bosses earn and the average worker earns have widened hugely. Mind you, we could argue the same's happened in football, couldn't we? I mean, I don't know what the cleaner at Manchester United is paid, but I bet that multiple against the striker has changed pretty markedly over the last...
I would be surprised if there's anything above the living wage, to be honest.
Well, that's probably right. But yeah. Sam, how do shareholders express their voices a bit more clearly, you know, on this issue? Because people do care about this. And, you know, I mean, one of the elements of that referendum last year was millions of people saying, do you know what? The big bosses, the big politicians, the big banks are having it all their own way and nobody gives us a voice. It was part of that frustration, part of that feeling of unfairness that did lead a significant number of people to vote for Brexit.
Well, perhaps instead of having governments meddling in, you know, asking people what they're getting paid and having limits and caps put on what people can get paid, how about they concentrate on transparency and letting people see what money's being pumped offshore, what money's being held in accounts that isn't being paid tax on.
Or what private health insurance they've got, or what other perks, or what their expense accounts are. Gosh, I hope that would never apply to me in a private company. But no, Sam, I think transparency rather than government interference, I agree with that point of view entirely. Sam from Aberdeen, thank you. Now, David Buick is back with me. David.
Nigel, I apologise, sir. I had a long conversation with myself, and it's unlike you and I not to interrupt each other. So, go ahead. Where have we got?
Well, David, you know, the point I'm making is that there is a perception out there that the big boys, the fat cats in corporate business are hand in glove with political leaders and with big banks, and that the world has become a very much less fair place. And I can see that what Theresa May has done today is to somewhat backtrack from her manifesto, which was very, very interventionist, and many would argue actually not very conservative in many ways. But David, my question is, how does the market, how do shareholders actually exert their influence to stop excesses? And by the way, I'm not going to fight you. You know, if somebody is a phenomenal chief executive who revolutionises a country, who gives those shareholders good dividends, and by the way, every listener here would benefit there from their pensions and all the rest of it, I haven't got a problem. Rather like, you know, the top striker of a football club. If he scored 25 goals in a season, you know, he's probably worth the money. But how does the market make sure the thing's being done fairly?
It's a combination of two things. I mean, your previous contributor, I completely and totally endorse what he says, is that there has to be a level of self-regulation and not government intervention. And it shouldn't actually be that difficult. The excesses are very, very clear for everyone to see it. But as I said to you before, I think comparing apples with pears is a dangerous thing to do. I have a complete disassociation between what I call entrepreneur and what I call manager.
Yes.
So somebody like Martin Sorrell, who's earned a fortune, he's run that company, man and voice, for 33 years. And he takes his money in the form of an enormous dividend because of his huge shareholding. People shouldn't worry about that sort of thing. Where I have a problem is where somebody like Rakesh Kapoor, who a couple of years ago had $39 million as a manager of Reckitt Benckiser, I don't think so. I think that's excessive. And I think basically that on boards of directors that I don't believe three things. Shareholders are much better than they were at abrogating their responsibilities to making sure that if they are aggrieved at the kind of awards that are given, that they actually do something about it. But I also think that non-executive directors in many of these companies don't do their job properly. And they sit and they draw their money, whether it's 25 grand or 100 grand a year, you know, for 4 appearances a year. This simply will not do.
So change is needed, David.
Sorry.
So change is needed somewhere here.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it's a question of a coordinated approach rather than government intervention. It should be, once you start interfering in what I call a free market or free enterprise, then you change the whole emphasis of business. The gap between those that have and those that have not is totally unacceptable. And there wouldn't be a single person in the country who would disagree with that thought. But how you actually come around to it, I don't know. But it has to be self-regulation is the greatest thing. People know perfectly well what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. The other thing that we, of course, never take into account, or the average person doesn't take into account, is what is international, Nigel, and what is just domestic. International, you are subject to the vagaries of competition everywhere. And the problem is that it's not just what you're going to do in the United Kingdom, it's whether you'll lose your chief executive to the United States or somewhere else.
No, I know. I get that, David. I understand that, and that is difficult. David, I thank you very much for coming back to us, having lost you to begin with. David Buick there, market analyst from Panmure Gordon, thank you. And he's making the point. Non-executive directors need to get off their backsides, stop taking money for nothing, and do something on behalf of fairness and shareholders and people who are going to earn pensions. I'm Nigel Farage on LBC. It's 4:15. Theresa May said in the Tory manifesto she would deal with fat cat corporate pay, and that's because the rich are getting richer, and they are, and the ratios between what the bosses of big companies earn and the average worker has widened and widened and widened over the course of the last few years. But when it came to giving her speech, she backtracked a little bit from full intervention, leading, of course, to the Labour Party and the trade unions, saying she was feeble and weak. But ultimately, if we've got a problem here with fat cats earning too much money and in some cases not producing the goods, the real question is, whose responsibility is it to deal with excessive pay? Is it the job of government, or is it the job of shareholders? Because what we're talking about here are the big footsie companies. We're not talking about the local entrepreneur down the road with 2 members of staff. We're talking about public companies. We're talking about companies who have shareholders, pension funds. In fact, we're talking about companies in which virtually every one of you listening has a direct stake. So this does actually matter. But should government interfere? And if government interferes, does it make it worse? And if not, how do we get shareholders to be a little bit more active at their annual AGMs? And I'm going to go to Roger in Storrington in beautiful West Sussex. Roger, good afternoon.
Oh, good afternoon, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. I'm sort of curious, Roger, because there is a lot of me that says that the modern corporate world, frankly, has got a bit out of control, and yet the last thing I want to see is for government to intervene. Or am I wrong, Roger? Should government set pay for everybody?
No, I think we've seen too much of a government bureaucracy, Nigel, and I think it damages entrepreneurs. What we need, I believe, is, if I can just phrase my question, because you recall Enron, the chief executive, based his performance bonus on share value, which can be manipulated without adding real value to the company. Of course, the shareholders also like to see the share price go up, so they're not going to control him. So the problem is, who is, as you quite rightly ask. Now, I believe that the best we can do is that we can find perhaps an independent company, as we have auditors, to actually do this on behalf of the shareholders and make sure that the terms and conditions put into his performance appraisal are properly targeted. I did this in a large company, used to be called NatWest, and I did it successfully, and it wasn't easy, but the point is I had no personal interest in the outcome. I was totally objective, except my job.
But things, Roger, at the end of NatWest did go quite badly wrong, didn't they? I'm not saying it's your fault, by the way.
No.
But things did go... But your basic point about Enron, and for those that don't remember, it was a huge corporate disaster and collapse, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. A lot of ordinary people lost a lot of money. But, Roger, your point then is that if you pay people, if you pay chief execs on what the share price is, that can be a totally false reflection of what the company's real profits are.
Absolutely. But both the chief exec and the shareholders like it.
And there we have the problem, don't we?
Yeah, I think that is the nub of the problem, Nigel. The other thing you could do, of course,
good point,
with chief executives, is to say, whatever you do, you will not get your bonus for 3 to 5 years unless the company continues to improve. And
that's putting it into what I think, as sort of accountants call escrow, isn't it?
Yes.
It's putting the money aside, so you've notionally made these profits, but you don't actually get the money until they become realised. Roger, I thank you for your call. Roger making a fascinating point there, and I think highlighting a problem. I want this to be something that the market sorts out. I want it to be something that shareholders sort out. But Roger very cleverly pointing out that if the shareholders have a high share price, even if the chief executive is drunk after lunch every day and then on the golf course for the rest of the week, if they've got a high share price, why should they be worried? Until, of course, reality comes home and the whole thing collapses. Not that Enron necessarily is the example for everything. Jim in Chipping Norton is my next caller. Jim, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Nigel.
So, come on, tell me, are chief execs paid too much money, Jim, in your view?
No, I don't think they are.
Okay.
If you're an investor in a company, you invest your money and you get your dividend or whatever, which is dependent on the performance of the company, which is not the chief executive. It's not the government's place to chip their oar in and decide what people are paid. I think we're actually on the wrong subject, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Far more concerned to me than executive pay in the private sector, which, after all, is the wealth generator of the nation. I'm more concerned with the fact that NHS chief executives on council, many public servants are paid double what our Prime Minister is paid. That strikes me as being absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, well, wasn't Tony Blair just wonderful for all these people in the public sector? Because not only, and you're quite right, Jim, not only are there people out there... I remember a few years ago looking at the northern town of Barnsley. Former mining community, not a wealthy part of the country as well, relatively small Yorkshire town. And we found that 6 people working for Barnsley Council were earning 6-figure money, and I frankly couldn't believe that. So I do understand your point about the public sector. Also, of course, in pension terms, the public sector now is very much better off than the private sector. So Jim, I do take your point, but that is something that I've not heard the Prime Minister say anything about at all.
Well, no, if you go back to the referendum, we were campaigning and using the fact that there were more NHS administrators and managers than there were beds.
Yeah, and of course, Jim...
I've got no problem with a consultant getting paid £200,000. If you've got a top heart surgeon, he's worth money.
Yeah.
But Somebody's just a paper pusher. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah, well, Jim, one of the arguments, and you raised the referendum, not me, one of the points I made in the referendum is there are 10,000 people working in Brussels for the European Commission and the European Parliament. 10,000 people who earn more than the British Prime Minister. So whatever you think the excesses may be in the public sector in this country, there is nothing as compared to Brussels. Jim, you may well be right. We may be having the wrong debate, but it's the one the Prime Minister is trying to have with us today, and I thank you. And on Twitter I get, Nigel, you and David Buick are in favour of the free market until it goes wrong, and then you expect the taxpayer to bail you out, says Mark. Well, no, Mark, I don't actually. One of the reasons I hate modern corporatism on the scale that it is we finished up with companies that were simply too big to fail. The idea that the taxpayer should be forced to bail out people in the private sector, frankly, is total anathema to me. I believe that people should have the opportunity in the free market to make money, but equally to be able to go bust as well. And I believe much of what happened in that collapse of 2008 was a direct fault of government policy and a change of good sound rules we'd had in financial markets since basically the Wall Street crash. Don't we get more tax from fat cats paying the top rate of income tax at 45% than if they were paid less and the money goes into company profit where it's taxed at 20%, says Michael. Well, Michael, it's a very good point, but what we're talking about here is fairness, a perception of fairness. And I don't think anybody, nobody could doubt that the gap between rich and poor in this country has got markedly wider over the course of the last few years. I'm going to ask Celia in Wembley what she thinks. Celia, good afternoon.
Hello. Yeah, can you just answer me this question? Because I've Googled this question.
Yeah.
And what I Googled is why should people who are very rich and come by their money fairly, they haven't treated their workforce like donkeys, not them fairly or given them fair conditions just so as they can keep the money themselves and go off and buy a £10 million yacht. But they money fairly. Why should they pay a load of tax? Because, I Googled it and all it said was because they could afford it. Well, I class that as theft.
Well, there is, you're right in a way, because one way in which governments do regulate pay is it, not by setting caps in the marketplace, but through taxation. In some ways they do. And it is worth, Celia, reminding, younger people listening to this, that up until May 1979, the top rate of income tax in this country was 83%. 83%. And on unearned income, it could be as high as 98%. But income tax ran at 83%. And what happened, Celia, with that was that so many of our brightest and best young people headed off for Australia or America or elsewhere. I do take that point, and I do think that taxation is one of the ways in which government does control those amounts of money. We had a 40% top rate tax rate for some years. We've now settled at 45. I don't see, frankly, much prospect of that going up or down over the course of the next few years. So would you argue, Celia, that we should all pay the same percentage regardless whether we earn a little or a lot?
Sorry?
Would you argue that we should all pay the same percentage regardless of what our income is?
No, I'm more concerned, and I think that what government should be concerned about is anybody who is getting rich on the backs of other people. In other words, they're not paying them fairly, not giving them fair paying conditions in order so they get a pile of money so they can go off and buy their yacht. That's what needs to stop. But you see, the problem is you can't just sort of put certain things in place because, like a lot of people say, that they know how to scrape the money back, to claw the money back. So I say give them some competition. Perhaps we should have some nationally run coffee bars and takeaways. And cake shops.
Oh, Celia, I reckon that's a recipe for disaster. But very interesting points you've made. More of your calls after the news and travel. I'm Nigel Farage, standing in for Ian Dale on Drive on LBC. It's 4:30. As we speak, there is a briefing going on in Texas by the US Air Force. A Major General is informing people on the latest situation in Texas with this huge tropical storm. One report I saw that said that one particular area had received 49 inches of rain over the course of the last 72 hours. Hard to believe. And now Louisiana and perhaps even Alabama threatened by this torrential downpour, huge, sort of one of biblical proportions, and we will in the next 10 minutes get a live report from Texas to find out exactly what the latest situation is. But for now, we're talking about Theresa May and her statement on big fat cat corporate pay. And I've yet to hear from a caller telling me that actually it's the government's job to set levels of pay. And anybody out there that thinks that, please call me on 0345 6060 973, text me at 84850, email nigel@lbc.co.uk, or tweet at LBC using the hashtag Farage and LBC. So far, most of you think that it's right that actually the market, the shareholders, sort this out. But Roger from Storrington quite wisely pointed out there's a bit of a problem here, that if a company has an inflated share price, even if it's as a result of excessive speculation and not reality, why in those circumstances would the shareholders want to limit someone's pay? So that really isn't particularly easy. Chris says to me on Twitter, the profits companies make are bypassing us and going straight to tax-avoiding CEOs. Of course, it's the government's job. May won't do it, of course. Well, Chris, I'm not sure that all CEOs are tax avoiding. I think a lot of them, particularly if they're PLCs, are paying their tax. But Chris, if it's the government's job to set pay for public limited companies, would it equally be the government's job to set pay rates for, let's say, footballers, or maybe international cricketers who are out there doing battle with the West Indies as we speak? That's the problem. If you really want government to intervene, and we had all of this, we had prices and incomes policies, not for bosses, for workers, but we had all of this back in the 1970s. It collapsed in huge acrimony between the trade unions and the government. It led directly to a general election that indeed the Deadwood Heath lost. And I just, OK, Chris, you believe that. I just find it really difficult to believe that government could get involved in this and do the job properly. Joanna makes a suggestion and says it should be an independent body moderating pay. Can't expect the companies to do it. Vested interests. Governments are also corruptible. So, but again, if you set up a so-called independent commission to set levels of pay, actually, in the end, effectively, it becomes an arm of government. If you have a pension, mortgage or savings, you are probably a shareholder by proxy in multiple organisations. Have your say, I get from Spike on Twitter. Look, yes, I agree with that. Absolutely. It's the point I've been making all the way through. This is not just some obscure debate about what's going on in city boardrooms. It affects absolutely all of us. I wonder whether Zainal in Crawley, West Sussex, has got a solution for us.
Hi there, Nigel. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My thinking is that when Theresa May became the leader of the party and then she became the Prime Minister, prior to that she had promised that there will be worker representation on the boards, like what they have in Germany. She said that is what she was pushing for. But then she backtracked on that and said it should be a voluntary thing done. If we do something like that, that the workers feel that they are part of this company, and they can have some input in how the whole thing is been run and other issues, it will be a good thing. But I think she backtracked on that and did a U-turn on that.
Yeah, I mean, Zaid, it's very interesting. When we look back at that sort of period of great economic and in many ways social gloom in this country of the 1970s, a lot of people say, it was all because of these terrible Marxist trade union leaders. But actually, I think there was some pretty appalling management around in British industry at that point in time too. Surely, if you're running a company and you want it to be a success, you want the workers to feel engaged, involved, motivated in terms of promotion prospects and pay prospects. So surely a successful company would not have a board that was completely disconnected from its workers. My problem, Zainal, comes when governments, and you're right, in a sense, originally she was suggesting that legislation should put workers on boards, and now she wants it to be something that is done sort of on the back of a recommendation. But Zainal, should government interfere with this, or should we let private companies sort it out?
Well, we have waited for too long for the private companies to do that, and they're not willing to do that. If you look at the German economy, we sadly have a situation in our country here where it's them and us attitude which is prevailing in industry and all that. If we added the German model that we are all working together, if you are working in one company, you're all looking for, to make that company successful. Then if you got everybody on board, then you can, it will be much easier to achieve that.
So the us and them problem in British industry, in British business, is still there, alive and well, in your opinion?
Sadly, yes. I think that we have still not got out of that mentality of them and us idea about the whole way that the whole thing is run. How can you have two different groups of people who, although each depend on other, but they want to sort of still maintain the whole system of them and us?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's a bit depressing, isn't it? I do not want the government to get involved and do this, but I can see that anyone running a private company that has got shareholder investment in it, it is in their interests to have a happy workforce that are doing their best and can see their own chances of improving themselves. And Zainal, if firms aren't doing that, and if there is the continuation of the them and us attitude, then there's a problem. But maybe one of those problems is maybe the average worker realises that his or her wages have been depressed over the course of the last decade, and there are perhaps a separate debate as to why that's happened, whereas they see the bosses getting more and more money. So I think, actually, Zainal, I think you're right. I think we genuinely do have an us and them problem that is there in British business and is there in British industry too. Hi, Nigel. Easy solution, Rob from Sutton is giving me. I like easy solutions. Link the national living wage to the pay of the FTSE 100 directors. Rob, if you do that, it's not free enterprise. If you do that, effectively, you've applied the rules of the public sector to the private sector. If you do that, you become the ultimate socialist, state-run economy. And all the evidence is that whenever you do that, whenever the government intervenes and tries to set prices for things, it simply doesn't work. And I think that, frankly, I'm sorry, Rob, you did offer it up to me as an easy solution. Frankly, I think that would be a disaster. Do we have a problem? Yes. Are the rich getting richer? Yes. Is there a growing feeling, perhaps, of disenchantment amongst people on average salaries who've spent 10 years seeing very little improvement? Yes. But is it the job of the government, and whatever colour of government, whether it's a blue one or a red one, frankly, the government, are the people who have worked to help to enhance this corporate culture that has led to this widening of the gap. And I do not believe their interference would do anything. We've got to get shareholder activism. We had David Buick on from Panmure Gordon saying one of the problems was non-executive directors. We had Roger from Storrington pointing out that if the share price is good, they're not going to do anything. I'm not saying I've got a perfect solution to this. I haven't. But I do believe if government interferes, it will make a bad situation even worse, because it nearly always does. I'm Nigel Farage on LBC. It's 4:45. In the last 15 minutes, Major General James Witham, Deputy Director of the Air National Guard, has given an update on the rescue efforts in Texas.
There are currently 3,000 Texas Guardsmen on duty today. They'll be growing to approximately 4,000 over the next 24 hours. The governor of Texas has requested a military police battalion and Air National Guard security forces to assist local, state, and federal law enforcement, specifically in the heavily flooded areas. That big metropolitan area around Houston is where we think most of that assistance will be required. In terms of rescues, and I want to be careful when I talk numbers in terms of rescues, obviously, these are very fluid. As you all see, there's a great deal of rescues occurring around, by the minute. but those that the National Guard has either directly done or supported civil authorities for, those include over 3,500 personnel rescued. Most of those, as you see, have been by some type of boat, but these also include almost 300 hoist rescues, which, as you know, are very technically difficult in terms of hoisting people off roofs where they're inaccessible by any other method.
Well, that was General Major James Witham, Deputy Director of the Air National Guard in Texas, giving us an update on the extraordinary rescue efforts that are going on there. And my next guest is John Labors. He's the editor of KTRH Radio in Houston, Texas. John, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Nigel.
What do you make of the statements that the Major General just made? I mean, is that the scale of it, or actually are people helping each other as well?
You're seeing an incredible amount of an incredible number of people that are just neighbors helping neighbors around here. I happen to, my office happens to sit right here on one of the major highways in the Houston area, and yesterday, whenever there were a great number of water rescues that were required on the north side of town, you could see truck after truck after truck going down the street, towing low draft boats, bass boats, and other types of vessels like that, in order to be able to help out with the rescue and the recovery effort. We just here within the last hour, I know the president has landed and he's surveying some of the damage down in Corpus Christi, a couple hundred miles to our south, but we had a levee breach along the Brazos River just to the south of us here within about the last half hour or so. And again, the moment that this news arrives to our listening audiences and to the viewership around the Houston area, all of a sudden, all of those people with their trucks and with their low draft their low draft boats, now they're turning around and heading down to the south side in order to be able to help with the recovery effort. It really is. It's amidst disaster, it is something that really restores your faith in humanity.
Yeah. I mean, John, what does it look like? I mean, is it just water as far as the eye can see?
It is water and rain on an unimaginable scale. And I tell folks all the time, I am not trying to be dramatic whenever I say that. I mean, we are seeing flooding on a historic level that has never been seen in U.S. history. It's just, I mean, whenever you're talking about rain totals that had already exceeded 40 inches since the start of this storm, and we're expecting another 3 inches today, they're talking about the possibility of 8 to 10 to 12 inches before this storm finally moves its way out of the region. I mean, the amount of rain, the amount of water is just, it's astounding.
And do we have any idea, John, as to what the casualty rate may or may not be?
We have heard as high as 14. There was some very, very tragic stories that came out of Pasadena, Texas, which is one of our suburbs here, of a family with young elementary school children all the way up through great-grandparents. And so it was several generations of family that was in their van. They were trying to evacuate, and apparently the father lost control of the vehicle, and their bodies were swept away at the floodwaters. So, I mean, there is a great deal of tragedy that goes along with everything we're seeing here.
And there may be many more stories like that we haven't as yet heard. And
unfortunately.
And the president, desperate not to repeat the mistakes of Bush after Katrina, he's there in Corpus Christi. Do you think that Trump turning up in Texas is a good thing?
It's a little premature to say. I think that people are heartened to know that the federal resources are staged and ready to move in as soon as recovery efforts are going to be able to start here in Houston. I mean, Corpus Christi is a couple hours south of us, and so I'm sure that they're probably already well on their way now. Yeah. We know that the resources are staged. We're still waiting for the rain to abate here before we can really start doing damage assessment and start worrying about resupply. And so I think in terms of worrying about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, we're merely heartened by the fact that we know the resources are there and they're just waiting for their opportunity to come in to help us out.
Yeah. John, thank you ever so much for giving us that briefing, and please, we'll come back to you in the course of the next couple of days. Thank you. That was John Labors, editor of KTRH Radio in Houston, Texas, talking there perhaps in slightly optimistic terms, that a horrible crisis brings out the very best in people in terms of them helping one another. And yeah, sure, there are helicopters taking people off roofs and all the rest of it, but ordinary folk going out there and doing their bit, which he said he found pretty heartening. So 40 inches of rain in most of Texas already, and another up to 8 to 10 inches expected. And some areas have had 50 inches of rain already. That is kind of more than, well, actually, that's more than most of the UK would get in a year, and they've had it in the course of a few days. Back for the last few minutes to my subject, that Theresa May, keen to be seen to do something about fat cat pay, but backs off ever so slightly from full government intervention, but says something must be done. Paul from Ealing is my next caller. Paul, tell me the government can solve all of this, please.
I'll tell you what the government can do. The government can mind their own business. All this is them wanting to know what people are earning or companies are earning. It's got nothing to do with them. It's got nothing to do with me. I come into work. My company earns millions of pounds a year. It's easy to work out. We all know that anyway. But it's got nothing to do with me. I don't want to be sitting on some board. It's of no use to me. It won't get me nowhere, and it's not going to improve anything anyway.
And what sort of firm do you work for, Paul? Is it a private company? Is it a public company?
That I don't know, but I drive a lorry.
Yeah.
So I'm here, there, and everywhere, delivering stuff, collecting stuff.
Right.
And we do well. You know what I mean? It started off as one truck, one driver, like the governor. He built up a reputation. We've now got 42 trucks, 42 drivers.
Yeah.
And we've got fitting bays, tyre bays, and we've got the offices, and we've got employed people in the offices, we employ people in the trucks, and we employ like a mechanic or two. Well, I say we, the governor does.
Yeah. So do you? I mean, Paul, do you and your? There's 42 of you driving trucks for the governor. Do you sort of feel at times resentful that perhaps he's earning 100 times what you are, or 150 times what you are?
No, not at all. It's a case of we're like, yeah. If we don't really talk about it, it's we don't come in and go, oh dear, I wish we could have a bit more of what the governor's earning. It's a case of the governor's earning what the governor's earning. The same with every company around the country, and it's got nothing to do with me how much the governor earns. It's got nothing to do with it's got nothing to do with anybody.
And Paul, are you incentivised that if you do your job well, your pay's going to improve, your conditions are going to improve?
Well, conditions won't really improve. I drive a lorry. I come in, I get in my truck, and I go out and do my work. It can't improve any more than that. And there's no... If I want to go and buy my own truck and spend the next few years building up a good reputation with companies and build up... I mean, this isn't something that's happened overnight. This has taken 20, 30 years. Do you know what I mean? And it's like people who turn around and say, well, yeah, but if we know how much the governor's getting, like he should share the wealth. Rubbish. You know what I mean? If you want more money, go out, do it on your own.
And take the risk. Yeah. Well, Paul, I think for the private sector, that is absolutely right. The only difference with this debate we're having now, this is about the big public companies, and David Bioek, our analyst earlier, said there's a difference between entrepreneurs and people who come in as managers. Paul, thank you ever so much for your call, and thank you, everybody, for contributing to that subject. Well, coming up next, Donald Trump has said that all options are on the table after North Korea launches a missile designed to carry a nuclear payload, and it went straight over Japan. And quite extraordinary that this morning at 6 a.m. local time, alarms were going off all over the islands and across northern Japan. A country that itself suffered 2 nuclear strikes, albeit 70-something years ago. North Korean regime has signalled its contempt for neighbours, says the Prime Minister of Japan. It's a very serious situation. What should the US President do next? Is it time to unleash fire and fury like the world has never seen, or is this the path to war?
On FM